The first of our 100 storms is a forgotten Western Pacific classic. A very intense typhoon that struck the southern part of Japan in September 1828. This storm was a Category 3 typhoon at least, with sustained winds known to be at least 125 miles per hour and a pressure down to 935 millibars, although it could have been as low as 900. It moved through southern Kyushu on September the 18th and continued northeastwards most likely through the northern part of Kyushu. It particularly impacted the towns of Saga and up towards Fukuoka. The storm allegedly caused up to 4.5 meters of storm surge, that must be about 15 feet or so, and its impacts were quite extraordinary. One of the deadliest storms in Japanese history, certainly, with over 15,000 dead. Some reports suggest possibly as many as 19,000. There was also 14,000 injured as well, so that's almost as many as those fatalities. Additionally, 36,000 buildings were damaged and 72,000 were destroyed. That's the 51st highest worldwide. The track of the storm swept through the western and northern part of Kyushu there, and was at least a Category 3 as mentioned, which is why I'm putting it at number 100 in my top 100 list. Darwin, Australia, December 1974. An unhappy Christmas surprise was to devastate this part of the Northern Territory of Australia, coming in one of its tiniest cyclonic forms, and that was Cyclone Tracy. Tiny because it is indeed one of the smallest storms on record around the world, only beaten by Tropical Storm Marco in 2008. Here it is, the track of Cyclone Tracy, forming from humble beginnings not far from the island of Yamdena, Indonesia, and continuing southwestwards, becoming a Category 1 equivalent as it moved past Melville Island, and then moving southwards, passing by and then striking the Darwin area as it hooked towards the southeast, affecting the area probably as a strong Category 3 storm. This storm was devastating for the area and cut off Darwin for quite some time, and things were quite difficult in the days following. 115 fatalities believed to have occurred from this storm, with monetary costs totaling $645 million back in 1974, the 204th costliest cyclone worldwide.
One of the badly damaged areas is Darwin's thriving airport. Millions of dollars worth of light planes have been smashed beyond recognition.
Many people ignored the storm's warnings, mainly due to a false alarm from a previous storm just a couple of weeks before, and the fact that it was Christmas Eve and parties were already in full swing when the storm was on its way and rapidly intensifying.
Well, it's impossible to think about it at all. The people are just in a terrible situation. It's the destruction is so complete. There's not a house that's...
Can you tell me what happened?
Oh, it's terrible.
What happened? What
Awful
did you see?
winds and all of our houses fell in. It's just a disaster.
What happened to your house?
Oh, the windows gone, the whole house just...
Essential services were destroyed, and over half of all the population of Darwin had to evacuate. Many never returned, and that's why we're putting Tracy at number 99 in my top 100 for Hurricane Week 2022. Here's another incredible historic storm that has mainly been forgotten, that affected particularly Siam, as it was known at the time, the Malay Peninsula and on towards India. This was in the late part of 1891. This was a storm that had its origins probably near the Philippines, and it was likely small in size to begin with and moved fairly slowly over the southern Visayas region. Eventually the storm developed into a typhoon well before it reached Thailand. The storm started to turn towards the west-northwest as it approached land, probably peaking very close to Koh Samui, just passing to the south, destroying the island and possibly killing up to 6,000. Population on the island at the time is unknown, but we do know from reports that only 39 survived. The storm then arrived on the Malay Peninsula itself, destroying at least 5,600 buildings and killing at least 109. It possibly even gained strength as it moved over the peninsula, as the greatest wind damage was reported inland and on the other side of the peninsula on Zedetki Island, which is also known as St. Matthew's Island, just off the western coast as it started to move out over the Bay of Bengal. The typhoon then headed on towards Port Blair. Pressure reports were probably around 956 millibars, that's what was actually recorded there, although interpolated data suggests that it could have been as low as 940 millibars. The storm then went on towards False Point, where it made landfall. That's on the coast of Odisha, a slightly weaker storm with winds of probably 125 miles per hour, gusting to 150. The pressure recording was 950 millibars, but once again, interpolation suggests that it may have been as low as 939. In total, this cyclone reportedly killed 7,401 in Thailand, although suggested numbers could be as high as 12,000. Surprisingly, no deaths were recorded in India. This storm was probably a high-end Category 4 or maybe even a Category 5 when it made landfall in Thailand. Our latest estimates stay at 155 miles per hour and a probably pressure peak of 919 millibars. And now one of the most well-known Pacific typhoon oldies, the Swatow typhoon of 1922, which affected the southeastern part of China, what is now known as Shantou, and made landfall initially in the Philippines, probably as a Category 2, and then strengthened rapidly to reach Category 4 status by the time it landed on the southeastern coast of China. This storm is known for its incredible amount of fatalities, 100,000 roughly, even though we don't know the actual damage statistics. It did come with it at least an 8-foot storm surge, if not higher, the 16th most deadly storm on record worldwide. This storm had an estimated highest wind speed of 130 miles per hour with that lowest pressure of 932 millibars, although that occurred a few miles away from the city itself and from the centre of the eye, so it is quite probable that this storm was actually a stronger storm, or at least a more intense storm with a lower central pressure. Nonetheless, the Swatow typhoon, even though we don't have much to document it, just a few images here, will go down as one of the most deadliest storms, particularly in the Western Pacific and particularly in Chinese history. At 96, another lesser-known cyclone that occurred in that tumultuous period that was the 1960s, and this storm occurred at the end of May 1963 as it approached through the Bay of Bengal from the south and would eventually go on to affect East Pakistan as it was known at the time. And whilst we don't know the exact intensity profile for the whole duration of the storm, it's assumed that it probably rapidly intensified as it approached the coastline, peaking as it made landfall pretty much directly over Chittagong as a strong Category 4 storm. This storm was also very impactful and caused over 11,000 fatalities in the region. Of course, it pales in comparison to some other storms, but it still is the 49th deadliest cyclone on record. This storm made landfall with winds near 150 miles per hour and a pressure estimate at sea of 919 millibars shortly before the storm hit land. This, of course, being a very bad period in the North Indian Ocean, the early 1960s. From 1960 to 1963, that's 4 years in a row, there were storms with over 10,000 fatalities each, and in some years there were more than one. In fact, this storm was hot on the heels, just a few days behind, another cyclone in the Arabian Sea that impacted Oman and the Arabian Peninsula and killed 22,000. So this storm, despite how bad it was, wasn't the deadliest of that same season. But this nonetheless is coming in at number 96 on our top 100. At 95 is an early season shocker that affected the Gulf Coast of the United States near the end of June 1957. Hurricane Audrey, as it became to be known, affected the coast, reaching Category 4 intensity before making landfall and striking near its peak intensity, causing extreme damage and devastation along the coastal area. Like many hurricanes we know, it made landfall pretty much directly over Cameron, Louisiana, and that area was quite devastated. 415 were killed by this storm. Whilst it is only the 285th deadliest cyclone in history, it is one of the deadliest US tropical cyclones, and 1,505 were injured by the storm. Additionally, 151,000 buildings were damaged and 4,500 destroyed, so quite a significant tally in those stakes. Maximum rainfall reached 270 millimeters, and it packed a storm surge of at least 12.4 feet. Monetary damages soared to around $200 million, which for the time was quite high. And of course, this storm's devastation was felt mainly in Louisiana and in Texas with the flooding later on, but the area that was worst affected was Cameron Parish, where most of those fatalities occurred. As we can see on this colour imagery, you can see some of the damage that occurred in the general area, but the storm's impacts beyond the actual landfall zone were deemed to be fairly limited, at least in terms of the wind. But the storm surge penetrated as far as 20 miles inland, and that was a big issue for many locations, and indeed inland locations were caught by surprise by this storm, and that's why one of the many reasons that we're putting this at number 95 in my top 100.
Well, the 1959 Mexico hurricane was a really classic October hurricane in Mexico. Well, like every October in the Eastern Pacific, hurricane always turned to the east after intensifying into a really strong hurricane. Has happened many times and still happens currently. And the 1959 Mexico hurricane wasn't the exemption. It was a really intense hurricane, peaking as a Category 4 hurricane with winds of 140 miles per hour, an estimated pressure of 955 or 958 millibars or something like that. When it was recorded, that pressure by landfall near Manzanillo, Mexico, which is the second strongest ever landfall Pacific hurricane in the history, and the deadliest hurricane in the Eastern Pacific Basin in history, with more than 1,800 deaths counted, which makes it the deadliest and one of the costliest Pacific hurricanes ever as well, if you adjust the damages to the actual inflation. So of course it was a really strong hurricane. Back on that time, it wasn't a really like a culture about tracking tropical storms or cyclones in Mexico. So misinformation and about the conditions in the oceans were really poor. So practically the people were taken by surprise with the arrival of that hurricane. Was a really strong hurricane. Operationally was classified as a Category 5 hurricane. But in a reanalysis done in 2016, it was determined that it was a Category 4 major hurricane based on the correlation of pressure and wind speeds. So regardless of it was a Category 4
Cyclone Winston first began in the Southern Pacific on February 10th, with the JTWC initiating advisories on Tropical Cyclone 11P at that time. And a short while after that, the Fiji Meteorological Service upgraded it to a Category 1 cyclone on the Australian scale, giving it the name Winston. Winston would then undergo a significant intensification phase, peaking as a major cyclone before weakening as it moved off towards the south. But something interesting started to happen with Winston's track. It turns off towards the northeast, which not many South Pacific storms do, and then stalled back towards the east, weakening down to a tropical storm to the east of Fiji. At this point, things were very uncertain. We weren't really sure where Winston was going to go, but ultimately, Winston would turn off towards the west, intensifying back to a Category 1 cyclone on the Saffir-Simpson scale, and then as it moved westwards towards Fiji, would undergo a phase of rapid intensification, becoming the strongest storm ever recorded in the Southern Pacific Ocean, peaking officially with a pressure of 884 millibars, which is the lowest ever recorded in the Southern Hemisphere, and a global low at landfall in Fiji, and 1 minute sustained winds officially of 180 miles per hour, though I believe 413 analysis is a little bit stronger than that. Fiji would ultimately fare the absolute worst of Winston, and would not see devastation like what Winston would bring to the island ever since, or even before that. Devastation was completely widespread across the island, and as a result of Winston's passage, $1.4 billion in damage has occurred on the island nation, and 44 people lost their lives from this catastrophic storm. After passing Fiji, Winston would gradually weaken and would turn back towards the south, but not before turning westwards once again and heading towards the coast of Australia, where it would die off as a post-tropical cyclone, lasting for well over a month in the South Pacific Ocean.
My personal opinion on Winston's intensity is that we haven't really seen the case and the reasoning for Fiji's pressure peak. To our knowledge, there's not been anything on the ground that corroborates an 884 millibar reading, so I'm more inclined to stick with our preliminary analysis when the storm first happened, with a maximum wind of 180 miles per hour and a pressure of 905 millibars. That's my take, and I'm sure there's plenty of debate to be had about the intensity of Winston, and I'm sure it's something that will be evaluated time and time again in the future. Orissa, India. The 20th century was about to go out with a bang in October 1999 with an extremely powerful cyclone that first developed over the Malay Peninsula into the Andaman Sea and then intensified gradually but certainly quickly towards Category 5 status, which it eventually reached on its final approach before striking Odisha. The storm making landfall probably still as a powerful Category 4 and then stalled over land, causing major storm surge and flooding issues for the whole region. The storm then continued southwards, moving back out to over the open waters, and then weakened some more and died off well down towards the south on November the 2nd or 3rd.
1919 Odisha cyclone was a remarkable super cyclone, which was the only Category 5 cyclone to make landfall after 1885 till now, after a dormant of 115 years on the basin. It was the deadliest cyclone in the recorded history of the state of Odisha, after killing 30,000 people, mostly by the storm surge, and mostly occurred in Jagatsinghpur. It also causes damage of 4.44 billion USD damage, and remains the costliest cyclone in the basin till 2008, when Cyclone Nargis arrived in the basin as extremely severe cyclone.
Whilst Category 4s happen quite often, Category 5s are still pretty uncommon in the North Indian Ocean, particularly in the Bay of Bengal. This one occurring so close to land was surely a really scary prospect, and that's why it's at number 92 in my top 100. Mauritius, 1892. an incredible cyclone that struck this island nation that occurred in the latter part of April. A substantial storm that emerged from the north and eventually curved round southwestwards and then southeastwards and went on to strike Mauritius as a Category 3 cyclone with winds of at least 120 miles per hour and an estimated central pressure of 946 millibars. This cyclone caused real devastation in Port Louis with at least 1,500 buildings destroyed. The fatality count is an area of slight confusion, but we expect that it's at least 900, but some estimates have it as high as 1,500. The monetary damage from this storm was also steep, quoted at around £2 million, which at the time was a very high amount of money. And indeed, it was thought for a while that Port Louis may not have been able to rebuild from this catastrophic cyclone. But in the end, of course, it did, and Port Louis remains to this day, still looking out for potential cyclones. This is certainly one of the strongest, deadliest, and definitely one of the most destructive cyclones to affect the Masserine Islands, and indeed this storm's death toll is only behind Cyclone Idai in 2019. That, of course, being the death toll rankings for the Southwest Indian Ocean. And possibly a claim that it was also one of the strongest storms in the entire southern hemisphere, and that's why it's number 91 on my top 100. Odisha, India, May 2019. And we were looking down the barrel of a very powerful cyclone that was approaching the coast of eastern India, first forming near the end of April in that year, of course, from an extremely low latitude near the equator, moving northwards, becoming a tropical depression, quickly followed by tropical storm status, and then a gradual movement towards the north-northwest. It became a Category 1 hurricane equivalent as it reached the same latitude as Chennai, and then continued northwestwards, becoming a Category 3, was moving northwestwards, and then it curved northwards, providing a fairly tricky forecast for those who were forecasting the storm ahead of time. And then it went on to make landfall after peaking as an extraordinary Category 5 storm with winds of 165 miles per hour, and our wind estimate of 913 millibars, before weakening rapidly after making landfall in Odisha, not far from Puri, and then continuing northeastwards, weakening to a tropical storm as it entered Bangladesh and back over into northern India as a tropical depression. Whilst the track was different, the impacts of this storm were quite reminiscent of the 1999 cyclone that we saw not long ago in our Top 100 series, and its impacts were quite similar. The price tag on this storm was at least $4.2 billion, although it may have been much higher. 72 fatalities occurred from the storm, and whilst it's not clear exactly how many buildings were damaged or destroyed, the damage was extremely extensive, and 2.4 million people evacuated from this storm ahead of time, which is nearly the highest amount that we've seen anywhere in the world. Madagascar, February 1994. The port city of Toamasina was about to get slammed by a major cyclone coming in from the Indian Ocean. None other than Cyclone Geralda, one of the strongest storms to occur in the southwest Indian Ocean, and certainly one that packed a dreadful punch to the eastern coast of Madagascar. Forming in the late days of January and then gradually intensifying for quite a few days, eventually reaching Category 4 and then Category 5 status. Well, it really had the looks when it was peaking at its Category 5 status, which was around a day and a half before it made landfall in eastern Madagascar. It did weaken, thankfully, a little bit before reaching land, weakening to a Category 4 more than a day out, and then down to Category 3 just as it was making landfall. It then moved inland, weakening to a tropical depression as well. It was over halfway through Madagascar by then, and it turned towards the southwest and obviously caused flooding concerns in those areas as well. There aren't many images or news about what this storm actually caused, Madagascar being a rather poor country, and unfortunately not much news comes out of there really, especially back in the 1990s. But clearly it was a humanitarian disaster, and 304 were killed by the storm. Also quoted as over 100,000 buildings damaged by this storm as well, and it was probably quite a bit more than that. 40,000 buildings were destroyed, and monetary damages, at least what we can account for, not very much, just 10 million, but I expect that it was probably quite a bit more, as we alluded to. A Category 5 storm at peak, Category 3 at landfall, Geralda was a very powerful cyclone and very memorable, and that's why it gets number 89 on my top 100. Honduras, September 1974. And the country was about to be gripped by a substantial hurricane that would pass very close to, but not actually make landfall in the country. And this was Hurricane Fifi. First starting out from the African continent as a tropical wave in the early days of September, moving out over the Atlantic, and it was quite a broad system in its early days over the Atlantic, but it never managed to get to tropical storm status despite its large size. It continued towards the Lesser Antilles, gradually moving pretty much due west for its whole duration through the central Atlantic. And by the time we got to the 14th or the 15th of September, it moved into the eastern Caribbean Sea and finally became a tropical depression, passing south of Hispaniola and starting to move further towards the west again, becoming a tropical storm south of Jamaica, and then continuing towards northern Honduras and towards the Yucatan Peninsula, strengthening to a strong Category 2 hurricane, almost a Category 3, passing just north of landfall in Honduras, and finally did make landfall in southern Belize, moving inland over central Mexico and actually re-intensifying a little bit as it developed into the next storm, Orlene, a double-barreled name, Fifi Orlene, and there it is near its peak intensity off the northern coast of Honduras. This storm will always be known for its extraordinary rainfall. 610 millimeters was the highest value recorded, but flooding and mudslides did a real number on Honduras, much worse damage than anywhere else from this storm. Over the following 36 to 48 hours after the storm reached the area, mudslides caused a huge amount of deaths, several thousand, and the numbers kept rising all throughout. In some areas, whole villages and towns were swept away, one of which happened during the night, almost eliminating one town's entire population. In all, it's thought that the storm produced over 11,000 fatalities, almost 12,000, damaged 100,000 buildings, and destroyed over 10,000. The storm's monetary damage was 1.8 billion, which was a pretty high amount for this particular era, and Fifi Orlene will go down as one of the worst storms to affect Central America and Honduras. Of course, let's not forget what happened on the other side as Orlene, where it peaked once again as a Category 2 hurricane before going on to make landfall in western Mexico. But it will always be remembered for its impacts and its effects and damages, mainly in Honduras but also in its surrounding countries. And that's number 88 on my top 100. Kyushu, Japan, September 1983. And a very impressive typhoon was embarking on its course across the Philippine Sea and headed straight for the Japanese islands. In the last 10 days of September, Typhoon Forrest sprang up from a wave that was moving through Micronesia and developed into a very strong typhoon. going along with pressures down into the 970s, and then the storm went absolutely berserk. This storm reaching an extremely powerful peak as a Category 5 with a pressure of at least 883 millibars detected by recon just 24 hours after pressures were in the 980s, so 100 millibars or nearly that much being gained or lost rather from the storm in an extremely short time span. Forrest is very often seen as a case study on what explosive intensification can really do, and is still one of the most incredible explosive intensification bouts that we've ever seen across satellite imagery era. This storm, of course, may have been even a little bit stronger than that. 883 millibars was directly captured by recon, but there was a gap after that, and so some extrapolations suggest that the pressure may have been as low as 876 millibars. This has been backed up by a World Meteorological Organization report, and so that is now the official intensity of this incredible storm. Despite that, and something compounding things a little bit further, Dvorak estimates on satellite imagery only reached T6.5, which isn't even indicative of a Category 5 storm, and recon planes themselves only captured winds of borderline Category 5 status. So this remarkable, extremely powerful storm, which is only around 6 millibars from being a record holder, may have only just scraped Category 5 status in terms of winds. I suppose this is one of many cases that suggests that there needs to be more to see regarding the Saffir-Simpson scale rather than just the wind speed, because a low pressure like this will have increased the storm surge and is also an indication of the storm's size as well. This storm did plough into Japan. It was in the 920s when it entered the East China Sea, and then it moved northwards and curved round towards Kyushu. It was much weaker by the time it got there, but it still caused significant damage in some areas. In total, 38 were killed by the storm, 46,000 buildings damaged, and at least 100 destroyed. The storm also produced very heavy rainfall over some areas with maximums of 540 millimeters. Forrest, certainly well known in the meteorological community, is number 87 on my top 100. Osaka, Japan, September 1950. A new tropical depression was forming at the last days of August in the open Western Pacific in 1950, and it eventually became Tropical Storm Jane, and it became a typhoon and intensified quite substantially as it approached Japan. It was a fairly short track storm, but it certainly developed quite intensively to Category 3 status and made landfall in Osaka Bay as a Category 2 before pushing off towards the northeast and then turning post-tropical just off Hokkaido. The storm surge from this storm piled into Osaka Bay, and that whole region was severely affected by storm surge. It was believed that 700 ships were marooned or damaged, and that the damages inland were also just as stark, with 192,000 buildings damaged and 512,000 destroyed from this storm. 250 were killed roughly, and 1,400 were injured. The storm also caused $27 million in damages. After the season, Jane was retired and was replaced with June. Antalaha, Madagascar, March 2004. The end of February into the first days of March heralded a new tropical depression, which would form after quite a little while as a tropical wave out in the open waters of the central Indian Ocean, moving quite aimlessly at first before turning more towards the west and then headed towards the southwest Indian Ocean landmasses. The storm intensified at a steady rate to Category 1 for a good while before it was more rapid towards the next step, reaching Category 4 and then Category 5 status as it approached northern Madagascar, making landfall pretty much directly over Antilaho as a Category 4. This was an incredibly powerful storm that remained quite strong as it continued over the whole northern part of Madagascar, still as a Category 1 in the Mozambique Channel, turning southeastwards, affecting the southern part of Madagascar as a tropical storm, stalling a little bit and then weakening and dying off eventually, although this wasn't the final part of this storm because it would regenerate later on as it was passing well to the south of the Masserine Islands and become a subtropical storm, so a second life for Gafilo as it continued southeastwards. It then moved on towards the east and then stalled again eventually and turned around, although it didn't really go anywhere after that. This storm was extremely powerful and caused really substantial damages, and its peak, of course, was the most intense tropical cyclone peak ever recorded in the Southwest Indian Ocean, reaching a central pressure of 895 millibars. Overall, damages were tremendous, with 2,000 buildings damaged and at least 21,000 destroyed. Of course, given this area, information's pretty sketchy, so it may have been higher. 418 were killed, which was quite a high amount for this region, a very high amount, and damages totaled $250 million. Given all that, and that it was the most intense cyclone in the Southwest Indian Ocean, it's fitting that it's number 85 on my top 100. Fiji, Kadavu, March 1979. A system that was hovering around the coast of Fiji for quite a few days as a disturbance for a good while, developed eventually into a tropical cyclone in the later days of March 1979 and became Cyclone Meli, a storm name that hardly anyone has probably heard of, although this did become an extraordinarily powerful storm against the odds and potentially against others' views. It became a Category 5 as it passed to the south of the Fiji Islands, passing through the Kadavu Islands as a strong Category 4 or possibly still a 5, and then diving towards the south and southeast, where it eventually turned post-tropical. The very fascinating thing about this storm is its intensity, which appears to have been grossly underestimated by authorities. Indeed, the officials of Fiji only estimated this storm to have peak winds of 100 miles per hour and a central pressure of 945 millibars. The JTWC went higher at 130 miles per hour, Category 4 just about, but when we take a look at the satellite images of the storm, it's clear that it was much more powerful than that. No matter what anyone really has to disagree about it, I think it is still an extremely powerful storm. Did it sustain for very long? Well, it did actually, quite a few hours during the day of March 27th, probably a full 24-hour period nearly of Category 5 status. The Force 13 estimate puts it at 175 miles per hour at peak and a pressure of 903 millibars. The storm was also deadly as well, killing 50 in total, including 19 that were sheltering in a church, which collapsed. In my view, the notability of this storm is much higher because it's, I suppose, a forgotten storm, and one that's been overlooked by more recent analysis, and that's why it's at number 84 in my top 100. Cassowary Coast, Australia, February 2011.
Yasi, one of the most powerful storms to strike the Australian mainland and certainly the most damaging by a wide margin in recent, or at least recorded history. The storm slammed northern Queensland in a way that hasn't been seen before or since, in fact. I think one thing that we can all remember all around Australia was the fact that the price of tropical fruit, mangoes and bananas absolutely went through the roof because it flattened all the crops up there, but a historic storm for everywhere affected, that's for sure, and one likely not to be surpassed for a while.
Yasi's origins were actually on the other side of the international dateline near Samoa, where it first started to become notable as a tropical disturbance, and it sailed westwards for a few days at disturbance level before finally becoming a tropical depression as it neared Vanuatu. By the latter days of January, the storm started to intensify, and that intensification phase would start to ramp up further and further as the storm got closer to Australia, peaking as a strong Category 4 on the Saffir-Simpson scale, Category 5 on the Australian scale, and then moving inland over Queensland, and it took a while to die off as well over the inland part of Australia. My estimate for the storm puts it at 155 miles per hour and 929 millibars, which I believe is pretty much what the official line on the storm is, but Josh thinks that this storm was stronger.
Yeah, Category 5, Saffir-Simpson and Australian scale, there's no denying its peak intensity, at least 160 miles per hour. It's certainly not one of the strongest storms out there, and the Australian region can throw stronger storms, that's for sure. But just looking at the satellite presentation of it at peak, it was crazy strong. It had to be at least 160 miles per hour, 140 knots. I think that's 270 kilometers an hour as well. If it was a Category 5 on landfall, I don't really know. I doubt it. It might have lost 10 miles an hour or 10 knots or so, but it certainly peaked as a Category 5. Devastating to complete total devastation. It looked like the places that had been affected were wiped clean. Trees were completely demolished, houses were torn to shreds. It was like a tornado had hit most of the places, and because Yasi was so wide as well, so big, impacts stretched from Townsville up towards Cairns and even further north. So widespread impacts and a very concentrated, powerful centre obviously resulted in a massive, tremendous impact.
Yasi was right near the beginning of my storm tracking phase in life, and being in the southern hemisphere, it wasn't really seen as that important compared to storms in the northern hemisphere. I do have vague memories of tracking the storm operationally, but certainly not as much as later storms. But Yasi, of course, was certainly a big disaster for Northern Australia, and goes to show the potential for some storms when they enter the Coral Sea. Yasi's number 83 on my top 100. Kyushu, Japan, October 1951. A tropical depression was brewing in the early days of October to the southeast of Guam, and continued on towards the northwest, becoming Tropical Storm Ruth, and then becoming a typhoon, peaking as a strong Category 4 storm with estimated winds of 150 miles per hour and a pressure of 924 millibars. That Category 4 peak happened just before the storm rounded the corner and turned northwards, headed towards the southern Ryukyu Islands, passing through as a Category 3 and weakening substantially, but was still a Category 1 by the time it swept through the main islands of Japan, causing a lot of damage. The storm became post-tropical as it moved well out to sea, and in its later days, in its post-tropical cyclone stint, it reached the Aleutian Islands and rounded towards the northwest, and then traced along the rest of those islands, moving back towards the Kamchatka Peninsula. Ruth was a very destructive storm. The Korean War was ongoing at the time, and some US and Australian vessels were caught in it, some at sea and some in port in various places in Kyushu, and there were several ships that were damaged, some aircraft carriers and other vessels, but the main damages occurred inland, particularly from river flooding. 147,000 buildings were damaged and 221,000 destroyed. Extraordinary numbers. Also, 1,294 were killed and 2,644 were injured. I guess it's really telling by looking at the amount of rain this storm dropped as to its damage, 639 millimeters, which is certainly up there in terms of Asian storms at least. So Ruth was a pretty powerful storm, a pretty forgotten storm as well, of course, and that's why I think it's wise to bring it to everyone's attention by making it number 82 on my top 100. Haulover, Nicaragua, November 2020.
So I believe Tropical Storm Iota started life out in like I want to say not quite the main development region, like more or less in the Caribbean Sea. It gradually, like as it traversed westward, I'm trying to recall my best from memory here, but as it traversed westward, that's when it intensified into Hurricane Iota, Category 1. Then as it inched towards the Nicaraguan coastline, that's when it began to rapidly intensify. And then operationally, eventually it was classified as a Category 5, and then it weakened slightly, made landfall as a Category 4, before wreaking havoc all across Nicaragua and Honduras. Now bear in mind that this was just 2 weeks after a similarly strength hurricane, Hurricane Iota, made landfall in roughly the same location just 2 weeks ago, also a Category 4. But it should also be noted that Hurricane Iota in post-analysis was downgraded to a Category 4 hurricane as well, 155 miles an hour. I'd only just joined the team at the time, so I was like the newest guy on the block, wondering what on earth I was doing half the damn time. But yeah, I mean, I learned eventually. Obviously, being on the live events, just watching the chaos unfold, like getting news it was Category 5 was like, I remember I was walking one of the dogs in my local forest when I received news that the NHC had upgraded it to Category 5, and I was just there like, oh my god, this is so serious, especially 2 weeks after Iota. And then I race home after walking the dog, and I get onto my computer here, and I'm like, guys, what on earth is going on?
Well, it's what we're all hoping against, but Iota has become a Category 5 on the Saffir-Simpson scale as it passes close to Providencia. On its way to Central America,
And yeah, I was sort of on like one of the earlier time slots, so it hadn't made landfall by that time then. Obviously, got into the late hours over here. Obviously, different teams were on. The storm eventually made landfall as a Category 4, and it was quite emotional, really, because I can remember some of the teams here. They nearly burst into tears whilst they were trying to compose themselves on the air.
Iota ripped through Nicaragua and the wider Central American region, killing at least 82 and damaging at least 91,000 buildings. The storm caused probably nearly $5 billion in damages, and Iota was an extremely difficult storm to handle right on the back of Eta.
And well, I had the chance to go and give some humanitarian relief for the storm in southern Mexico, which was affected by mostly the rain, not that much the wind. But after such a big storm, it was expected for a lot of areas to get impacted. So I actually went to the mountains in Chiapas, which is a state in southeastern Mexico. And I was there for 5 days, bringing over 2,500 medical kits and hygiene kits, and also food kits for the families there, because the rain pretty much destroyed a lot of towns. And well, I got there, I believe it was on the 8th of November, if I'm not mistaken. And I was there for 5 days, and basically it was raining the whole time. I couldn't see the sunlight for like 5 days because the whole sky was covered by the clouds of Iota. and well, it was a life-changing experience for me because it was really the first time where I went to give humanitarian relief, especially for a hurricane, and I don't know, it just seemed like most people don't realize how impactful storms are in that area of the world, especially in Central America and in South Mexico, because not a lot of people in the media don't really look at it that much. But since the infrastructure there is not really that good, lots of places got destroyed and lots of houses got destroyed.
The disaster caused by both these storms also led to the launch of Force 13's new charity feature, Force for Good, which was already in the planning stages, but this event clearly made us decide what we'd be fundraising for that year. And that is something we're doing for the third time this year in 2022.
Yes, the Force for Good we did. It was quite an exciting time, really. We obviously did like an 8 or 9 hours stream overnight. In my time, I think it finished at like 5 in the morning over here. And yeah, we embarrassed ourselves to say the least, all in the name for a very, very good cause of raising money for Nicaragua and Honduras after the effects of both Eta and Iota. If memory serves me correctly, one thing we did was a Minecraft challenge, which we failed, and the punishment for failing that challenge was for a family member to dunk a bucket of ice water over our head. Which was great fun. That had to be filmed in my area a few days after, and I had to prepare for it and everything, whilst I think everyone else just sort of did it right on the spot.
We certainly won't forget Iota, and that is number 81 on my top 100.